Inheritors by August Derleth. From Weird Tales, December 1929. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. The Story of a Lethal Curse. The Inheritors by August Derleth. There is no longer any valid reason for withholding the true facts of the tragedy at Hudson Heights from the public, and I chronicle these facts now in response to the pressure of public opinion. The matter really began with Mommsen's note of the 7th, asking me down for the 17th, or before if possible. Mommsen was an old chap, but always intensely interesting. Our mutual interest in archaeology had brought us together some years before. From the first, Mommsen had been interested in old houses. A mere interest had developed into a passion, and within a half-year preceding the note of the 7th, I heard from a mutual friend that he had finally acquired an old colonial mansion somewhere along the Hudson. He had named it, aptly enough, Hudson Heights. It was at this place that Mommsen met me at midday of the 17th. He was little changed except for the faint lines that appeared around his mouth and eyes. His hair, too, was graying at the temples. "I thought you weren't coming, old man. I'd about given up hope." He laughed as he took my suitcase, and again when I explained that I had been detained at the office. "I might have suspected that." He disappeared into another room with my belongings. When he returned, I began to question him. Could it be his birthday? I dare say I amused him, for he brushed my questions aside, explaining that he had called me down because he thought me the most reliable of all his acquaintances for the thing we were to go through. This was a point gained, and I urged him on. "You notice there's a striking lack of servants?" he asked. I nodded. I had noticed it and had intended to ask about it. In a house like this, and with the money that Mommsen made no secret of having, the absence of servants was inexcusable. "Every year the servants take off on the 17th of this month. Prior to this year, even the owners of the place were out on that day." "Why?" I asked in ill-concealed wonder. He shrugged his shoulders. "On the 17th of February, this place is turned over to the ghost, or ghosts, whichever it is. Only on this date is the house haunted." With this he rose, refused to answer my questions, and promised to take the matter up in detail at dinner that evening. Dusk was coming on when we seated ourselves at the table in the old dining room. Mommsen began his story without hesitation, though I noticed that he was vaguely disconcerted by the absence of the servants, for more than once his hand stole out toward a bell cord, as if to ring a bell in the servants' quarters. Beyond that, he was perfectly at ease. "The whole thing started in 1792, on the night of the 17th of February. One Hendrik Van Dam, then owner of this place, much the same at that time as it is now, was fatally stabbed with a rapier while he was at the table. He was stabbed in the back, so the story goes, and did not know who stabbed him. Nor would anyone tell him, for I understand he was cordially hated. He cursed all in the house on that day in the double breath that remained to him before he died. A great many versions of the curse got about, of course, but everyone seemed to agree that the curse would pass off only when the oldest of 4 generations of the murderer's descendants had been killed. That much sounds as if it might have happened, doesn't it?" I nodded. It struck me that I had read of the incident in some old history of New York, but as of the moment I found it impossible to trace my source. "What follows doesn't sound so plausible. It seems that everyone in the house on the 17th died within a year. Quite naturally. However, I understand it was thought somewhat unusual that all those people should die before the following February, but coincidence is not ruled out. Some people put the whole aftermath down to coincidence, but most of the natives candidly profess the belief that the deaths had occurred through the diabolism of the dead Van Dam. After that, the place stood vacant for a good many years. In 1827, a well-to-do New Yorker took the place, remodeled it somewhat, and prepared to live in it. In the house, this man found a packet of letters that proved conclusively that Matilda Van Dam's lover had killed the old man. It had been prearranged, and on the basis of general hatred of old Van Dam, it was carried out without even the protest from his wife. At any rate, nothing remained to make anyone hesitate about living in the house. In 1828, on the first 17th of February that he was in the house, the new owner died. The doctor said that there had been some heart trouble, but it got around that there was a curious burnt mark on the man's breast. A year later, the man's son and heir died in precisely the same way. Then the family decamped, and, of course, the curse and its history were bruited about once more. On the strength of the letters found, an addition was made to the curse, that those who lived in the house before the time the curse had expired would inherit the curse and all its evil. But the real inheritors were to remain the oldest in each of the 4 successive generations of the murderer's line. At this point, too strong a coincidence to be disregarded enters into the story. You have been aware of my eccentricities, among them the peculiar and inexplicable dread that I undergo on the 17th of February. I recall that Mommsen had once said something, and said as much. He went on. Well, the letters found in 1827 give the name of the murderer as Mommsen, which is not entirely like mine, but similar enough to be taken as an old form of my name. That fact in itself means nothing, of course, but when you add to that the knowledge of my grandfather's sudden death after the birth of his only son, my father, and my father's tragic accident on the night of my birth, the coincidence begins to take a definite form. On top of it, I might add that we know absolutely nothing about our ancestry beyond my grandfather. It is entirely possible, you see, that the lover of Milady Van Dam was a lineal ancestor of mine, my great-grandfather, most probably. Right, I exclaimed. In that case, he went on without hesitation, he would have been the first of the inheritors, and I will be the 4th. I ridiculed the suggestion, and he freely accepted the ridicule. He considered the chance remote, and had only mentioned it as such. But to go back to the story of the house, he said at last, in 1872 it was again occupied. Since the region was saturated with the legends concerning the house, it was thought advisable to vacate it on the 17th of February. This was done regularly until 1877, when the head of the house excused the servants, but stayed in the building himself, together with his family. He was found dead in the morning of the 18th. The doctors again said, heart trouble, but no doctor could explain the burnt mark on the man's breast. After that, the house was faithfully vacated on successive 17ths of February. Thus, in time, the legend got about that old Henrik Van Dam returns on the night of February 17th to kill the head of the house. Psychic investigators say that the house is merely the abode of forces of evil, which manifest themselves on that particular night, and it is true that no one has ever seen a ghost here. It is my opinion that all of this is a vast coincidence. You and I are up here to prove the statement tonight, and I hope we'll do it. But there are several things that bother me, and one in particular. When I first got into this house, something happened that I've never quite forgotten. In a moment when my mind was wandering, I got up one day from the table and walked into a wall as if to pass through a door. Later, when I looked over old plans of the house, I found that there had originally been a door in that place, but that it had been sealed over in 1827. I said nothing, for I frankly did not know how to take the story. It was considerably outside my ken. You can imagine the reaction of a staid businessman in such a position. "Well," I said at last, "I'm willing to face the ghost if you are." He nodded and set about to clear the table. What happened after that I'm not certain. I know that Mommsen and I sat and drank his good liquor until both of us were feeling somewhat unnecessarily gay under the circumstances. It all started when Mommsen got up from the table and went to the door. He stuck his head out into the hall and came back to the table. "I say," he said, "do you smell anything?" "No," I answered, but even as I said it, a faint whiff of smoke came to my nostrils. "Sulphur, isn't it?" asked Mommsen. I agreed with him. "Got any in the house?" I asked. "None, and nothing that would smell like that, I'm sure. It must come from outside. Just notice how the drapes of the windows billow inward. Where'd that wind come from so suddenly?" Perhaps the liquor had made us both rather hazy. The lights seemed suddenly dim. Mommsen stood opposite me. His eyes were raised somewhat. They were fixed on the window opening on the terrace. I turned. There was nothing there save the drapes which whipped to and fro in the wind. The atmosphere was heavy with the odor of some obnoxious drug that seemed to deaden us. A swirl of fog seemed to fill one room. Mommsen raised an arm suddenly and pointed. "Look!" he screamed. "Look!" But I could see nothing. The air was cold with a ghastly chill, and from a distance came the sound of feet running. It was as if they were coming toward us with the wind that had suddenly arisen from some eldritch source, and was sweeping now through the old dining room. Then there sounded far away a cry, rising and falling, demonic, shrill, fraught with horror. At the same moment Mommsen's face twisted utterly. In the dim light that fell on him, he looked grisly. The shadows on his face stood out like great black holes in his white skin. "Look!" his voice whispered eerily. "Look!" He flung out his arms as if to ward off something, then he fell flat on his face. At once the eerie disturbance was stopped. The rushing, whistling wind was gone. The drapes at the windows swayed gently. There were no sounds of running feet, nor weird cries from the sky. The lights became brighter. For a moment I stood there, trying to recover myself. I remember that I reached for the decanter of liquor before I thought of Mommsen. Then I ran to him. The shock had been too much for him, I thought, and bent to pick him up. His hand was cold as ice. It needed no expert to tell that he was dead. I turned him over on his back. His eyes were wide and staring. His face was a picture of abject terror. But it was his breast that attracted my immediate attention. His dinner coat and vest were virtually burned away, so that his breast lay exposed. Just below the breastbone was a dark brownish discoloration, as if a long dead wound had burned itself to the surface. It looked for all the world as if the point of a rapier had come through from the back, leaving the flesh burned in this unholy manner. The fourth Inheritor, I murmured half to myself. Even as I said it, there came a whirling breath of ice-cold air that struck me full in the face, passed, and was gone. I turned. The long drapes at the window were shuddering, but above the horror of it all, I felt a vast, brooding sense of peace. The end of The Inheritors by August Derleth.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.